So welcome back. Now we're going to look at the concept of arguments. So far, we've looked at logic operators and their meanings and their interpretations. So let's have a go and look at the concept of an argument. All right. So at first glance, when normally with the usage of the language English, when an argument is mentioned, this is the most common form of argument that will come to mind, right? So depending on your sphere of expertise, you interpret this word argument differently. So this is one way of looking at it, right? Then you also see when you are in a court session, they will say both sides should also present their arguments, right? So you never find this scenario, or you rarely find this scenario in a court setup, right? So what argument are we talking about in this module, right? So when we talk of argument, you're specifically speaking to a similar setup that we find in the court of law, right? Where an argument is simply people presenting their facts, or they are called arguments in the sense that they are presenting perceived facts or actual facts at a given point in time. So they can take turns, like they do in a debate, or sometimes it may be a one-sided argument. It depends, right? So if you look at Parliament, right, they also have arguments, but then it can be distorted sometimes to a rowdy gathering, right? Which is what this would be, not a place where arguments are presented. Yeah. So in logic, right, we find that we are in the field or in the sphere which evaluates arguments. Right. So an argument, or the definition we're going to use an argument, is given as follows, right? An argument will be a group of statements or a statement, right, including one or more, and I'll highlight here premise, right, and one and only one conclusion, right? So you can have more than one premise, and then you can have only a single conclusion. So this is single. So this makes sense in my example of the court of law to say that you have got the defense side of things, you have got the prosecution, or both will come and present their facts, their findings, and then one person is going to arrive at a conclusion. Right? There will be a single conclusion. So either the judge will reserve their judgment, or find it guilty, not guilty, whatever the case is, but a conclusion will be reached based on the arguments that have been presented to the judge. Right. So what is a premise? Right? A premise is a statement, right? It will provide reasons for support. Right. So back to the court case again, or court scenario, you have got two lawyers usually, and then one of them is supporting the not guilty verdict, the other is supporting the guilty verdict, right? So each and every one of them are putting effort, or is putting effort to ensure that their preferred verdict is reached. So this is not, in the context of all things involved, not a fair proceeding. So if one side, even if they know, and that can be the case, if one side, even if they know something that can exonerate you, will choose not to say it simply because it does not support their narrative. Right. So a premise is a statement in an argument that provides reason or support for the conclusion or preferred conclusion. Right. There can be many premises in a single argument. Right. So premises will then turn into what we can call facts, right? So we want all premise to be a true statement. And this is also true in the court of law, right? You cannot perjure yourself in court, or you cannot say something that you know to be false in court. So all premise are true statements, right? So all premise are true statements, right? So this is the fundamental setup of logic to say that given that this is true, we can then reach the following conclusion. Right. So let's evaluate an argument, right? So we can have multiple premises, and then this is called a sequent, right? So sequence meaning follows on to, right? Or leading to. And then we have a single conclusion, right? Premises can be multiple or it can be one. All right. Now, arguments, right, can be evaluated. Right? So we can evaluate an argument and see whether or not it is valid or it is not valid. Right? So in this, we are looking at it as a whole. And then I'll give an example back again of the court case. If you go into, or you've been called to court and whatever the case, the proceedings happen, and then the judge agrees to or reaches a disagreeable conclusion, right? Usually what can happen is the matter can be taken to a higher court. Say you are the magistrate, you now go to the high court, right? And then the judge at the high court might see that you are right. The conclusion that was reached was not, in fact, correct, right? So it would mean that the whole argument was invalid. The premise that were given and the conclusion that was arrived at, right, were not aligned, right? So if the premise are true and the conclusion is also true, then the argument is said to be valid. So premise, we are saying they are true, right? If then we are able to get to a true conclusion from the given premise, then we say the argument is valid, right? If we have the opposite, if we want to define invalidity, right, we look at the premise being true, but the conclusion is not true. Right? How do you know that the conclusion is not true, right? If you know the conclusion is not true, then it becomes false. So we're going to look at this. I think we've come across the contradiction operator, where if the premises are contradicting themselves, we get to a contradiction, right? So a contradiction is something that is always false. So it can happen that if the premises keep on contradicting each other, then the conclusion, or we get to a contradiction. Right? So if the premises are false, the conclusion can either be true or false, because the conclusion is being drawn from a pool of false statements. Right? So any conclusion is therefore acceptable. What do I mean? Let's look at real life scenarios. Right? If you are given the wrong tools to do a specific task, right? Someone wants you to, let's say for argument's sake, they want you to mow the lawn, and they give you a knife, right? Even if you get the lawn mowed or cut to the correct size that is required, it can still happen through your persistence. But then if someone gets back and you haven't done the loan because you had a knife, you are not to be blamed as well, because it is not natural. It is not the case that a knife is used to cut the lawn. So given the wrong tools, you can either somehow manage to get the job done, or you do not get the job done. Nothing can blame you. No one can blame you in case. So that is what we get to in terms of validity. To better illustrate this, right? Let's say we have got premise and we've got a conclusion, and then this is our truth table. We want to look at an argument. Right? So if the premise is true and the conclusion is true, then we are saying the argument is also valid. Right? If the premise are true and the conclusion is false, then the is not valid. Right? And then given the wrong tools, and then you still manage to somehow get at the desired point, then we can say it is still valid. And even if you don't, it is still valid. Right. So that is the concept of an argument. The only time that an argument is invalid is when the premise are true, but the conclusion is false. Right. So it is easier to prove invalidity than it is to prove validity, because to prove something is not valid, you have got one scenario to look at. Right. Then if you want to prove that something is valid, you first ask yourself, is the premise true? If it is true, then you go, is the conclusion true? Then okay. And then you look at scenario number 1, scenario number 2, scenario number 3. It needs to satisfy either one of these for an argument to be valid, but if there's only one scenario where it is not valid. Right. So that is the nature of arguments. They can be valid or they cannot be valid. In the next video, we're going to look at examples of validity and non-validity so that we can better understand this concept.